Today's webinar, Understanding Our Urban Forest Assets, Methods of Tree Inventory and Urban Tree Canopy Analysis, is made possible through Forestry and Natural Resource Webinars, a partnership with the North Carolina State University Cooperative Extension, Southern Regional Extension Forestry, and the Texas A&M Forest Service. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Eric Wiseman. Dr. Wiseman is an Associate Professor of Urban Forestry and Arboriculture at Virginia Tech in the Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in forestry and wildlife from Virginia Tech and his PhD in forest resources from Clemson University. Prior to entering academia, Eric worked as a commercial arborist in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast regions and is an ISA certified arborist and qualified tree risk assessor. His research and extension efforts focus on arboricultural practices, urban forest ecophysiology, and urban forest inventory and analysis. Dr. Wiseman currently serves on the Southern Wildland Urban Interface Council, the Executive Committee of the Arboricultural Research and Education Academy, and the Board of Directors of the Virginia Urban Forest Council. He is also the coordinator of the Virginia Big Tree Program. Eric?
Great. Can you hear me okay, Sean?
Yes.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to talking to you today about urban forest assessment. I appreciate Sean giving the bio for me. Just fill in a little bit more there for you. As Sean was saying, I do work at Virginia Tech, and I am Associate Professor of Urban Forestry. And I've been involved with urban forest assessment really all the way back to when I worked as an arborist for a commercial tree care company and actually did a couple of tree inventories there. And then once I arrived at Virginia Tech, one of the first big projects I undertook was having my undergraduate students work on a complete tree inventory on campus. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And since then, I've got involved in some research projects looking at street tree assessment in Virginia and also working on the Virginia Urban Tree Canopy project. And I'll talk about both of those as well during the time today. As you can see on the front page here, my email address is listed there. It's arborist@vt.edu, as well as the webpage for our urban forestry program here at Virginia Tech. So let's go ahead and get started. As Sean was saying, you folks can use the chat box to type in any questions you have along the way. What we'll do is periodically stop and let Sean have a chance to look over those. If there are any clarifying questions or if you have something specifically related to something I mentioned, please feel free to put that in there, and then we'll try to address that as quickly as possible. So welcome, and look forward to talking to you today. What we'll do first is we'll start off with discussing some of the learning objectives of what we want to accomplish today. Quite frankly, it's kind of hard to put one of these webinars together because it's kind of difficult to anticipate what the background is of your audience, but I'm kind of coming at this today from the angle of this being just an overview and an introduction to urban forest assessment, and probably intended for those who are at the introductory or intermediate level. We won't be getting into a whole lot of detail of highly technical aspects of urban forest assessment, but really just trying to understand conceptually what urban forest assessment's about and what some of the options are that are out there. So let's real quickly look through these learning objectives. First of all, number one here, simply going to define what an urban forest assessment is and discuss some of the key concepts revolving around urban forest assessment. Number two, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the basic applications and approaches to urban forest assessment. Number three, I hope to help you understand the capabilities and limitations of urban forest assessment approaches. Number four, we're going to talk about tree inventory methods. There are several different methods out there, and we're going to elaborate on those, how they are similar and different, and also talk about some of the tools that are out there for conducting tree inventories. And then we'll conclude by talking about urban tree canopy analysis. That's what the UTC stands for, urban tree canopy, for those of you who might not be familiar with that terminology. So looking at some UTC methods as well as the tools for conducting those. So Sean had already asked this question here, so I'm going to skip over that one, but I do want to know a little bit about my audience. So let's take a moment here and answer this first question of what your affiliation is. And Sean, if you could display those results whenever the tally gets close to the end. I'm not sure how to do that. Okay, it looks like for those of us who have responded, they're predominantly with state or federal agencies or at university level. So we got a good mix because we have a few people in there from all of these different ones. For those of you who put other in, if you wouldn't mind just in the chat box typing in what your affiliation is, and that'll be helpful to us as we go along today. Okay, good. So the next question I have alludes to what I was asking earlier about our background and familiarity with urban forest assessment. If you could just respond to this question here so I get a sense for what our level of familiarity is. We have at least one pro out there, and that's good to hear. Maybe I need to hand the mic to you. Oh, we have several pros. So being an educator, of course, I'm looking at the distribution here, and it looks like it's falling out along a nice normal curve. Thank you, Sean, for displaying that. So the majority of us are kind of the middle of the road. We either worked on a urban forest assessment a couple times, or maybe read about them but never necessarily done them. Okay, that's good. All right, moving along. So the first place I want to start today is just giving you my opinion of what a definition is of urban forest assessment. This is my definition based on years of working now in urban forest assessment, doing a lot of the work myself, as well as doing a lot of reading about the work that my colleagues are doing around the country. So here's the definition I have. It is the observation and evaluation of three things: the quantity, the quality, and the distribution of urban forest resources within a defined geographic area of interest. So obviously that geographic area of interest can be quite variable. It can range from literally an individual parcel of land all the way up through a subdivision, up to a neighborhood, up to a zip code or a census block, all the way up to the municipal level, and then of course at the regional level, state, and then the national level. And indeed, urban forest assessments have been done on all of those scales. And as we'll learn later on when we're considering what we need to think about when we're setting up an urban forest assessment, one of those aspects is of course defining what your geographic area of interest is. Let's break down this definition just a little bit further and look schematically at the two key pieces of this definition about the observation and evaluation. So observation is simply the process of collecting data. And as we'll learn in a few minutes, collecting data about the urban forest resource can either be done directly with your boots on the ground in the field, or it can be done through remote sensing, that is taking aerial photographs or satellite imagery of the urban forest resource. But essentially what we're trying to do with this observation is to quantify or qualify the urban forest in some way. So this includes things such as locating where forest resources are, identifying what they are, for example, maybe the species that make up the urban forest, measuring the various physical dimensions of the trees and their growing environment, classifying trees, for example, maybe the condition rating of trees or the age class of trees, and then finally perhaps using rating systems. So this might have to do something with the quality of the growing environment that the tree is in. But ultimately what ends up happening is these observations become data, and we analyze these data and we ultimately make evaluations or judgments about the quantity, quality, and distribution of the forest resource. So I'm showing here just a few examples of the things that we might evaluate. For example, the existing or potential urban tree canopy cover in an area of interest, various tree population metrics, species, size, condition, the connectivity and spatial relationships of both the forest resource and green infrastructure, but also the surrounding human environment, identifying assets, liabilities, and risks that exist in the urban forest, clarifying where the high value versus the low value resources are, and similarly where the threatened versus secure forest resources are. And then finally, all of this information here ultimately helps us understand where the management opportunities are, what the ecosystem functions of that forest resource might be, and what the associated benefits and costs for people are. So when we start thinking about the applications of an urban forest assessment, you find that there's a lot of different things that we can do with an urban forest assessment. And I put these things into a Venn diagram to point out that an urban forest assessment doesn't have to apply to just one of these applications. They can perform multiple functions, and obviously that intersection of these circles kind of illustrates that sometimes an urban forest assessment can fulfill multiple purposes. But generally the reasons that we do an urban forest assessment is to advance science, advance the management and the policy of the urban forest, or as an outreach and education tool. If we look specifically at management of the urban forest resource, we see urban forest assessment fitting into what's known as the urban forest management cycle. And basically this cycle revolves around 4 different questions that have some intermediary activities. So typically the cycle begins up here at the top with what do we have, and then it proceeds clockwise around the cycle asking a series of questions. So the first question is simply, what do we have? That's where we're trying to understand the quantity, quality, and distribution of the forest resource. To do that, we perform a resource assessment. Now today we're specifically talking about urban forest assessment, that is the green infrastructure itself. But indeed, when we are thinking about managing the urban forest, we think about assessing other resources as well. We think about assessing capital resources. We think about assessing human resources. We think about assessing social resources. So a lot of different things play into the puzzle here in terms of resource assessment, but today we're really talking about the physical green infrastructure resource itself. So once we know what we have, we then proceed to asking the question, what do we want? What is our vision and expected outcome for this forest resource? So what that means is that we typically go about this process of coming up with management objectives. And ultimately we take those management objectives and we articulate them into a management plan. That management plan becomes the roadmap of where we are to where we want to be. And then ultimately somewhere down the road we're going to ask the question, are we there yet? And what that means is going back and looking at that initial vision, those initial management objectives, and doing some type of reassessment of the forest resource and the urban forest environment to see if our management plans have had an impact. And ultimately right here in the middle, this is our overall goal typically in urban forest management, to attain a sustainable, high-value, multifunctioning urban forest. So as you can see here, resource assessment is important at 2 points here. First of all, answering that question of what do we have, and then ultimately answering the question, have we gotten what we wanted to accomplish? And that is through reassessment at some point in time. All right, let's move into now discussing the 2 basic approaches of urban forest assessment. I do at this point want to point out that a lot of the information that I'm presenting to you today is obviously based on the work of a lot of different people, but in particular, one piece of literature that's out there that I have referred to pretty heavily is a publication that recently came out of the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station entitled A Guide to Assessing Urban Forests. And I'll have the information about this publication at the very end when we look at resources. But at this point I wanted to acknowledge that as being a really good piece that's out there that really summarizes how we assess urban forests. And this is where we get this idea of these 2 fundamental approaches. Essentially what we have is a bottom-up approach that we see here. This is Jeanette Hoffman. She was a research associate of mine a few years ago, and she's actually there working on a street tree inventory in the city of Roanoke. And it's called bottom-up approach because just as Jeanette's there, her boots are on the ground and she's looking up at the trees and she's seeking to make observations about the quantity, quality, and the distribution of this forest resource. Well, increasingly so, what we're doing is we're using a top-down approach, and this is more specifically referred to as remote sensing because what we're doing is we're using either satellites or aerial photography to capture images of the land cover and then use computer programs to remotely sense the quantity, quality, and distribution of that resource. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at two basic applications of these approaches. The bottom-up approach, we'll talk about the tree inventory, which is a type of field inventory technique. And then we're going to look at UTC analysis, urban tree canopy analysis, which is a remote sensing technique. But before we get into breaking down those two basic approaches, I did want to take a minute to comment on the capabilities of these two assessment approaches. That is, in this table we compare and contrast their abilities and their applications for the acquisition and application of data. I think it's important to point out that oftentimes when you hear the question or you hear the comment that I'm going to do an urban forest assessment, oftentimes people will respond by saying, well, are you going to do a tree inventory or are you going to do a UTC analysis? And I think the important point to make right here is that it's not an either or. That is, they're not perfectly replaceable types of assessments. Indeed, they have very specific applications and very different capabilities and limitations. And when we go about selecting how we're going to do an urban forest assessment, we have to think very carefully about these capabilities and limitations, and also understand that to do a comprehensive urban forest assessment, you rightly should have a combination of both bottom-up approaches, that is a field-based tree inventory, as well as top-down approaches, that is an urban tree canopy analysis. That is going to give you the most comprehensive, richest set of data. Now, it's not always going to be the most appropriate thing to do because of cost, time, and other restrictions, and of course the intended application of the assessment. But they're not an either or. One is going to be preferable in some situations, whereas in other situations the other is going to be preferable. It all depends on what the goal of your assessment is. So let's take a moment here and talk a little bit about this table here and its contents. So first of all, I'll point out this is how I have qualitatively rated these various dimensions of the capabilities of these assessment methods. And again, I just want to point out that I put this table together based on the Northern Research Station's Guide to Assessing Urban Forests, but I did adapt it a little bit. That is, I abbreviated it some, and I also inserted some of my personal observations with these assessment approaches. So probably the first thing that's most important to understand here in terms of the cost and the time and the level of expertise required to do one of these assessments is that it is highly variable, both for doing a tree inventory as well as doing some type of remote sensing. It's going to vary for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, the first reason it's going to vary is depending on the geographic scope. It's going to take more time and it's going to cost more money as the scale of that assessment increases, as you go from the neighborhood level to the municipality level to the state level and so on. And along with that is also considerations for the degree of expertise. Indeed, we see urban forest assessments being done all the time across a broad range of capabilities and expertises. We see community volunteer tree inventories being done all the way up to the scale of having board-certified master arborists and consulting arborists conducting tree inventories. These levels of expertise are obviously going to have potentially a profound impact on the accuracy and the quality of the data. And you have to think very carefully about what the intended application of that data is and what rigor it will require. And also the expertise level is going to be dictated by what it is that you're trying to observe. Obviously there are some very simple things out there in the urban forest that people with very limited expertise can accurately assess. In other instances, there are very complex things that should be left to the capabilities of an experienced professional. So the point here is that the cost, time, and expertise is highly variable with both techniques depending on what the intent and scope is of the assessment. So looking down through here, probably what you'll readily notice is that the bottom-up approach, the field tree inventory, has a lot of ease in it. And the reason for that is because a lot of these attributes that we're talking about here relate to the individual tree and can only be readily assessed by making observations and measurements in the field. The capabilities of remote sensing aren't just there yet, but I would very strongly speculate that over time, and of course this has been the case, that our ability to assess some of these physical attributes of trees is only going to get better with remote sensing. Indeed, we've gotten to the point now with LiDAR, for example, which is this three-dimensional remote sensing technology that allows us to very accurately measure the physical dimensions of trees. And then when we start looking at technologies such as hyperspectral imagery, there's research out there now where both the condition as well as even the species of individual trees can be determined from satellite imagery or aerial photography. So the capabilities with the top-down approach with these physical attributes of trees are only going to get better. But for now, if you need a high level of accuracy and reliability, you still need to have boots on the ground making observations in the field. Where top-down approaches really distinguish themselves from the bottom-up approach is in their capabilities, the capability to do one thing, and that is to accurately measure, quantify, and map tree canopy cover, as well as other types of land cover. And this is really where we see the application most commonly coming with remote sensing right now. That is for doing analysis of urban tree canopy cover, for goal setting, for planning, and so forth. Okay. What I want to talk about now is the urban forest assessment model, and basically what this is a conceptual framework that kind of helps you understand what are the key components of putting together an urban forest assessment. I've already mentioned previously that we always start up here at the top with identifying the goal of our assessment. And if we base that goal of the assessment on these two broad approaches that we just talked about, you'll see that we can kind of go in one of three different directions. Now again, these do not have to be mutually exclusive. There may be instances where you might be wanting to try to accomplish all three of these things. But the way that we generally break these down is first trying to understand the composition of the forest. So how many trees there are, what is their species diversity, what is their size distribution, what is their condition, and so forth. Benefits assessment is understanding the ecosystem services, the structural value, and the associated costs of the forest resource. And then finally, canopy cover assessment. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the forest composition assessment tends to rely on the bottom-up approach of a field tree inventory, where canopy cover assessment is usually most efficiently and effectively done with some type of remote sensing. In terms of benefits assessment, predominantly at this time, the input data for getting good estimates of ecosystem services relies on field-based inventories, but increasingly there are models that use remote sense data to come up with estimates of urban forest benefits as well. And again, I would contend that our capabilities there will only get better through time. So once we've determined what the goal of our assessment is, we then need to think about our data acquisition method. And that's where we're going to make the decision of either doing a field inventory or using some sort of remote sensing technique to collect data. Once we have our data in hand, we're now ready to analyze the data. And of course, going along with that is quality control and quality assurance of the data. And ultimately, based on this analysis and evaluation of the data, we will report and disseminate the results of the urban forest assessment to some audience. And the audiences can be very narrow or very broad depending on what the goal of your assessment is. For example, your assessment might be specifically targeted at the citizens in your locality. That particular report might have a very different style and structure than a report that you might be preparing for a highly technical audience or for a political audience. So the point here is to think about how you're going to report and disseminate the results of the urban forest assessment and to structure your reports accordingly. Okay, so now is our opportunity to do our first question based on the webinar today. So the first question here is, what are the two basic approaches of urban forest assessment? So if you'll take a moment and answer those. And Sean, I don't know how you handle displaying the results or not, since this is for CEU credit for some folks in the audience. So we'll continue to wait here and give people who, okay. All right, so here we go. It looks like that D was the majority of folks that answered, and indeed that's correct. So the two basic approaches of urban forest assessment are the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. Good. Second question for you. In choosing an urban forest assessment approach, one must consider what? Let's take a moment and answer this one as well. Okay, we're doing great. All right. Yeah, so the answer here is D, all of the above. We want to consider the assessment of the goal, or excuse me, the assessment goal, the available resources for conducting the assessment, and then finally, what are the capabilities and limitations of the possible approaches to conducting the assessment. Good. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to, now that we've covered some background concepts and terminology, we're going to drill down into discussing tree inventories. Again, this is the typical way that we go about doing a bottom-up urban forest assessment. Tree inventories are nothing new. Indeed, they've been around as long as urban forestry's been around. I've seen examples of ledger books of street tree inventories from Milwaukee that date back to the 1930s. So taking an inventory of urban forest assets is something that's deeply seated in urban forest management. What I want to do is first of all talk a little bit about the types of tree inventories. And we generally break these down into three different types based on what we are trying to accomplish with the tree population of interest. So the first is a complete inventory. This is also referred to as a census. So if you think for a moment about the U.S. Census Bureau, what they do is every 10 years they go out and they attempt to account for or inventory every individual that's in the United States. Well, that's what we're doing with a complete inventory. We're doing an inventory of the entire tree population within a defined geographic area. So again, this could vary in scale. It could be a parcel, it could be a neighborhood, it could be an entire municipality, or it could be trees of a particular placement. So for example, we could have a complete inventory of, let's say, just street trees, or a complete inventory of just park trees, or a complete inventory of just plaza trees, or maybe some combination of all three. The point here is that we've defined a population in a distinct area, and we are counting every individual in that population. Now, as you can probably imagine, reflecting back on time, cost, and expertise, conducting a complete inventory takes a lot of time, and therefore costs a lot of money. So for that reason, it can oftentimes not be a very efficient way to create useful information about the urban forest. So increasingly what is being done, borrowing from classical forestry mensuration, is conducting what's known as a sample inventory. So this would be analogous to doing a man or woman on the street interview survey, where you're taking a certain representative portion of the population and then trying to characterize that so that you can make inferences about the population as a whole. So typically what we're doing with a sample inventory is we're either using randomized plots that are placed in the urban forest that we then visit and count and characterize trees, or we're using transects. So transects is just a linear strip of land, and this is most applicable when we do street tree sample inventory. So what we'll do is we'll sample a portion of the road mileage within the city. We'll go out and maybe inventory, let's say 10% of that total road mileage. We'll go to a transect. It might be 50 meters long, it might be 100 meters long, and then we'll walk along that transect and we'll count and we'll characterize trees there. We'll then use statistical calculations to derive descriptive statistics about the population as a whole. So as you can see, if we're only having to look at 10% of the population, as long as we have a random sample of a subset of the population that's very representative, then we can make some strong, valid conclusions about the character of the population as a whole. And then the third type of tree inventory that we have is known as a partial inventory. And this is often referred to as a survey. And what we're doing here with a partial inventory is we're looking at just a critical portion of the tree population. So essentially what this is it's a complete inventory of a critical portion. So an example would be doing a hazard tree inventory, for example. We might be doing this inventory across all street trees, all park trees, all plaza trees, but what we're doing is we're only looking at trees that meet some predetermined criteria related to their structural integrity. Another example might be if you're trying to put together an emerald ash borer response plan. You might go out and do a partial inventory of just native ashes, ignoring all the other trees because the focus, the aim of your assessment is to understand native ashes as that relates to preparation and response to an emerald ash borer outbreak. So there we have the three types of inventory: complete inventory, sample inventory, partial inventory. Again, complete inventories, they require a lot of time, a lot of resources, but they do give you definitive answers about the population, and they're most commonly used for instances where a locality is doing continuous systematic management of the urban forest. In contrast, the sample inventory, you're only looking at a representative portion of the population. Therefore, you can't say with certainty what the overall character is of the population, but you can get enough information, for example, to draw some broad-based conclusions that are helpful for perhaps strategic planning or high-level goal setting for the urban forest. Okay, let's move along. And I want to look at the different options for conducting a tree inventory. So we have these three different types of inventory: a complete, sample, or partial inventory. And depending on which one of those we select and what our requirements are for the accuracy and integrity of the data, we then have some options for how we actually go to the field and collect that data. So that's what these tree inventory options are here. So the first we have here is what I call the user customized. Basically what that means is some group makes a decision, we're going to do an inventory and we're going to do it our own way. That is, they're not relying upon some existing technology or protocol that was developed by some other group. And there's a lot of inventories that are done this way on various scales. These tend to be on smaller scales because of the limitations, particularly of doing a pencil and paper inventory. But sometimes when folks incorporate technology, so for example, they might use an ArcPad script. So ArcPad is a GIS program that you run on a handheld device in the field. But the point here is that the user is making decisions about what characteristics that they're going to observe and measure of the trees, and then put together the inventory protocol to their custom needs. Another option that we have here is what's known as the iTree toolset. And iTree Tools was developed by the U.S. Forest Service and its partners. It's been out now for about 10 years. And I'll talk more about iTree Tools in just a moment. But when we look specifically at field-based tree inventory, two of their products are what are most commonly used. The first is iTree Streets, which, as the name implies, is intended for street tree inventory and assessment. And then iTree Eco looks at the urban forest more broadly. That is, it encompasses trees growing in many different land uses, ownerships, and so forth, depending on how you constrain your assessment. We'll touch on those in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. I will point out right here that the iTree tools are particularly attractive to folks because these are publicly available. They're free tools. All that you have to do is go to the iTree Tools website. There you can download the softwares, and typically what they consist of, at least for Streets and Eco, is a desktop application, as well as, if you choose to use it, an application that runs on some type of mobile device. So the mobile device is intended, of course, to collect the field data. You then bring that back to the office. You upload it to the desktop application, and then iTree Streets or Eco have these built-in models that were developed by scientists at the U.S. Forest Service and their partners that then analyze these data and report statistics that characterize the structure, the function, and the value of the urban forest. The third item here is what is known as crowdsourced inventories, and these are becoming very, very popular, particularly with the advent and familiarity of people with web-based mapping technologies. Probably the most predominant one that's out there right now is a crowdsourced platform called OpenTreeMap, and it was developed by a company called Azavia. And there are numerous instances and examples of these open tree maps out there now. Philadelphia has one, San Francisco has one. But the cool thing about these is they rely on the capabilities and the interests of the community as a whole. That is, no single individual is predominantly charged with collecting the data. Everyone, that is the crowd, provides the data that ultimately builds the database. And then the cool thing about this is it's on a web-based platform, so you go to a website and you can see the tree population that's in a particular community or municipality. And what's particularly cool about the open tree maps is they have linked that data about the physical characteristics of the trees, that is where they are, what they are, and how big they are, to the ecosystem services. So these open tree maps are particularly effective as outreach and education platforms because people can go there, they can contribute to the data, so that creates a level of engagement and ownership, but they can also learn about the trees that are in their community and all the important benefits that they provide. Obviously, there are some concerns about quality and integrity of crowdsourced data, but I've attended a couple webinars now by the OpenTreeMap folks, and there are some safeguards in place that a user can set up to ensure that people who are contributing data have some minimal competency to collect that data, and there are mechanisms for screening the data as well. So there are some quality control, quality assurance methods in place. Now OpenTreeMap, it does require a subscription that varies in price depending on the number of trees, But another product that's out there is called Tree Plotter Lite, and it was developed by Planet Geo. And in full disclosure here, I'm familiar with the folks at Planet Geo because we've actually collaborated on a project here in Virginia doing some planning for urban tree canopy conservation and enhancement. With that said, they have put together what they call the Urban Forest Cloud that has a number of urban forest assessment tools. One of those is this Tree Plotter Lite, and it is a free service. It's again a web-based service where you can go and enter tree inventory data, and it will be mapped on a website, and it is again a crowdsourced type situation there. So those I'm sure that there are other examples out there. Please don't send me hateful comments because I omitted someone, but those are just two examples of this increasingly popular crowdsource option. The final option that we have here is contracting with a commercial vendor. And again, just a couple examples here. The reason I chose these two here, Bartlett Inventory Solutions and Treekeeper Suite, these are two national companies that have been and continue to provide for a fee tree inventory services across the entire country. So why would you choose a commercial vendor to do a tree inventory? Well, there's at least a couple reasons. One is, of course, concerning the quality, accuracy, and integrity of the data. The people who are the inventory technicians for these companies are typically minimally a certified arborist with numerous years of field experience, and then they typically have additional credentials as well. So you can be assured that you're getting a high quality product. But the other thing is that you can avoid the opportunity cost of spending your own time doing a tree inventory. So if you work for a municipality, for example, if you're facing the prospect of doing a tree inventory and you're going to do it, well, that means that's time that could be spent doing something else. Maybe your expertise, your proficiency is not in doing inventories, but it is in tree planting and tree pruning. Your time would be better spent doing tree planting and tree pruning and paying someone to do the inventory who could do it more effectively and efficiently for you. So this is just a general overview of the inventory options that are out there. You can see that they span a broad spectrum of capabilities and potential costs. What you have to do again is make a decision of which of these options best suits your assessment needs and the available resources that you have. Okay, so the final thing I want to talk about related to tree inventories is the data hierarchy. That is, what do the data look like that go into an inventory, and how do we understand it so that we make good decisions about what we measure and what we observe. So we break down the data hierarchy into three levels: features, attributes, and values. The features are the things that you are observing and attempting to characterize. So in most cases, it's going to be just live trees. But depending on the aim of your assessment, it might be live trees and dead trees. Or it might be live trees, dead trees, and stumps. And to take it a step further, you may even want to understand not only what I have in terms of trees, but also what I could have. So you might also be inventorying available planting spaces. So the features are the things that we're inventorying. The attributes are the characteristics of those features. So this would include things such as the location of a feature, what its physical dimensions are, what its characteristics are, and then finally when we're talking about tree management, what is the history of maintenance, the needs for future maintenance, and what is the relative priority of those maintenance needs. And then finally, each one of these attributes has some corresponding values. So these can be either qualitative or quantitative. So for example, when you identify a tree, you give it a qualitative value for its name. That could be perhaps just a common name, or it could be a botanical name. It could be just the genus and species, or it could be the genus, species, and the cultivated variety. So now you start to get some insight into the levels of precision, and this has an impact on the precision of the resulting data. Same thing can be said for quantitative values. So for example, when it comes to measuring trunk diameter, which is probably the most common physical measurement that we measure, we might measure that very precisely by using a D-tape and measuring it to the nearest inch. Or our data precision needs might not require that level. Perhaps it's just sufficient for us to know what the diameter class is of that tree. So obviously, not having to take the time to wrap a diameter tape around the trunk to get a precise to-the-inch measurement of trunk diameter, not doing that, but instead just looking at the tree and saying, well, that is a tree that's in the 9 to 16 inch size class, that can save a lot of time and therefore control the cost of the inventory. Again, the trade-off there is, of course, the precision of the data. And this is an important decision that you have to make when you're putting together your inventory, is what level of precision do I need in order to fulfill my assessment goals. And that's going to vary from assessment to assessment. Okay, so just real quickly, a couple of examples of tree inventory uses. I mentioned at the outset of today's program that I had overseen undergraduates here at Virginia Tech working on a complete tree inventory. So again, that's a census. So we accounted for about 4,800 trees on the campus. This is the web-based GIS that we put together for the inventory. And you can see here in the center is a map viewing area, and each one of these little green icons is a tree, and that's overlaid on a aerial photography based map. We have querying features in here, so you can go to the website and you can enter the name of a tree, and then it will report back a table of how many trees fit that description in the campus tree inventory. In terms of application, how have we used this? Well, a couple different ways. One is it's certainly been a wonderful educational tool for urban forestry students at Virginia Tech. Another way is it's been instrumental in our designation as a Tree Campus USA. And there are a few different criteria that relate to the management of the urban forest and community engagement in urban forestry for the Tree Campus USA designation, and our inventory helped us with that. And probably the other thing that's helped a lot is to help us understand the composition of our urban forest. As with many places in Virginia, we just have way too many Acer rubrum, and that became very evident once we did this tree inventory. And since that time, we have been de-emphasizing the planting of Acer rubrum on campus and looking for suitable alternatives to plant so that we could decrease the dominance of Acer rubrum and therefore reduce some of our vulnerability to, for example, Asian longhorn beetle if it ever got here. Another example is, as I mentioned at the outset today, is a project that we completed here in Virginia a few years ago. It's the Virginia Street Tree Assessment Project. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here other than to say that the intent of this project was to understand our vulnerabilities in the state to emerald ash borer. So what we did was we used iTree Streets, and we did sample street tree inventories for a select group of municipalities around the state. Ultimately, we did about 25 of these localities, and we ran them through the iTree Streets program. So it not only told us how many trees we had, and specifically what the relative abundance was of native ashes, but it also told us what the benefits of those trees were from ecosystem services and what the replacement value was. So this has been really important in understanding both what the vulnerability is to emerald ash borer. Fortunately, we do not have a high vulnerability. On average, we have about 5% relative abundance of native ashes in our street tree populations. But it also shined a light on what we might stand to lose if emerald ash borer got here. In other words, what would be the ecosystem services that we would stand to lose, and what would be the cost of attempting to replace that forest resource if emerald ash borer destroyed all of the native ashes. Okay, so we have another pop quiz question here. I hope you've been paying attention for the last few slides. So this question is asking, what is a complete urban tree inventory? So if you can take a minute for those of you that are interested in answering the question. Okay. All right, so the correct answer here was actually D, all of the above. A complete inventory is also called a census. It is an inventory of all trees in the population of interest in a defined geographic area. And because you are looking at every tree in the population, which is very time intensive, you have to think very carefully about what features, attributes, and values that you're going to use, because each feature and attribute value that you add to the protocol means more time and more money, and that may not necessarily end up being of value depending on what the aim is of your assessment. Okay, so we're now going to spend the last few minutes here talking about urban tree canopy analysis. As you can tell, I've predominantly worked with ground-based field inventories, and for that reason I've elaborated on those more, but I did want to give you some insight to UTC analysis. And what this chart shows us here is the process of coming to determine what type of UTC analysis method that you want to use. Of course, things always start out up here at the top with what is the goal of the assessment. So what will be the application of this data that we're collecting? So we have this goal statement here, and from there we can branch out in basically two different directions. And this is going to relate to the data acquisition method. One acquisition method is what I call a pixel census, and that'll become more clear to you in a minute when I discuss it. And the other broad method here is what's known as a point sample. Again, keeping in mind that this is all based on remotely sensed imagery, either from a satellite or from an airplane. So with a pixel census, the process that we're using to create data is what is known as image classification. That is, a computer program is using imagery of the landscape and is classifying each pixel into some type of land cover. Of course, we're predominantly interested in tree cover, but typically these image classifications also quantify building impervious, non-building impervious, non-tree vegetation, water, and so forth. With photo interpretation, we're doing the same thing, but in contrast to having a computer algorithm make the decisions about what each pixel is, we are using our own eyes. That is, a photo interpreter, an individual who's been trained, will set and they will make a decision of each sample point of what that land cover is. So let's go down here and talk about our next consideration would be the data resolution need. And basically what that refers to is what level of discernment do we want to be able to make about ground-based objects, and therefore the accuracy of the classification or the interpretation. So image classification is what is typically done with when you see a UTC analysis out there. So the U.S. Forest Service has done some of these. University of Vermont has done some of these. The Chesapeake Bay program has done some. Virginia Tech has done some. But they use different either aerial photography or satellite imagery. So one of the first ones here is the National Land Cover Database. It is very coarse resolution, and it is actually utilized in an image classification tool called iTreeView. These UTC analyses that you commonly see reported, though, what they commonly use is what is known as NAPE imagery. That is National Agricultural Imagery that comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it is of higher resolution, therefore higher level of discernment than the NLCD. The NLCD is 30-meter resolution, whereas the NAPE imagery is 1-meter resolution. And then we can get really sophisticated by either using individually or supplementing this aerial imagery with LiDAR. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and this is this imagery that gives you a three-dimensional representation. So the NLCD and the NAPE are two-dimensional, just on the ground, LiDAR accentuates that by also telling us about the vertical component as well. So this allows us to measure the physical dimensions of trees and understand how they relate to the physical environment with greater detail. So ultimately, the data applications for this image classification, because you are classifying every pixel in an aerial image or satellite image, you can do several different very powerful things. One is mapping the entire landscape. Another is combining that data with other GIS layers to do very sophisticated analysis about the proximity and connectivity of these land features. And because of this level of analysis and capability, it's very useful for example, setting municipal urban forestry policies, or for prioritizing tree planting and tree protection. Now, jumping back over to the photo interpretation, this is a sample method. So what that means is that the photo interpreter is just classifying selected points across the landscape, in contrast to the pixel census that is classifying every pixel out there. In terms of photo interpretation, the most readily available tool that's out there right now is called iTree Canopy. iTree Canopy is in the iTree tool suite, and it utilizes Google Earth in an online application. That is, you do not have to download a standalone application from iTree Tools. You can simply go to the iTree Canopy website and you can conduct an urban tree canopy assessment, or more generally a land cover assessment, right there in your web interface based on Google Earth imagery. Now, because this is a sample, it has some limitations in terms of its application. Predominantly, the way that it is used is in one of few ways. First of all would be for high-level planning. So instances where we just need to know the quantity of tree canopy that's out there, but not necessarily where it is or how it relates to other land uses and land cover types. Other possible uses are, for example, benchmarking, so knowing where we are right now, and monitoring, so keeping track of where we are through time as the landscape changes. And then because it is so readily accessible from a technology standpoint, it's also a very powerful outreach tool. Oh. Sean, did you want to interject there for a second? I know we're about out of time here, but I'm getting close to the end.
Okay, just for a second. I won't take you too long. I'm going to go ahead and post a link to the post-webinar quiz and other various forums if anyone is time limited. I will be pushing these out at the end of the presentation as well.
Okay, good.
So check the chat box for that link and go on.
Okay. I think in about another 2 minutes we'll be done. So I appreciate it, people would stand by, but if you need to move on, I understand that as well. So let's look at these two basic methods of UTC analysis in a little more detail. So first of all, talking about this image classification. So what we start out with is this aerial imagery. So in this example, we have this 2008 NAPE imagery, 1 meter resolution. A computer program is then taught or trained to classify each pixel. And that's what this is. This is land cover that's been derived from that aerial image by a computer program. And you can see from the legend here how it has classified every pixel into these major land cover types. Then what we can do with that, at least what we did in the Virginia example, was the Virginia UTC program, was we set the existing percentage on a per parcel basis. So we've now further reclassified this data in a GIS, and each one of these colorful little polygons that you see here is an individual parcel. So where you see really, really dark green, that means that that particular parcel has a lot of canopy. And where you see the really, really dark red, that means that particular parcel has very low canopy. Then when we combine that data with other layers, we can start to see very interesting relationships amongst tree canopy and land ownership, land use, and other types of socioeconomic and geopolitical attributes. So this becomes really, really powerful for doing things such as goal setting, prioritizing tree planting and protection, or creating urban forest policy. Now, looking at the photo interpretation method, again, this is the iTree Canopy that I'm talking about here and showing an example of how this works. These are just some screenshots from their website, but essentially what you do is you start out by defining a project area. It's very scalable. You can literally go from the parcel level up to the municipality level if you want to. But first you define this area of interest, and then what the program does is it sets about randomly placing some points on the landscape layered on top of this aerial imagery from Google Maps. And if you look where this little yellow crosshair is, what is happening is the photo interpreter, so this individual here, that's Ethan Crockett, one of our graduates from a few years ago, that individual sits there and classifies each one of those land cover types depending on how you set up your assessment. These are kind of the typical, over here on the right, the typical land cover classes that you can classify each point based on, but these are customizable. You could do just tree versus non-tree if you want to do this very quickly. Ultimately, what you end up with is the program will calculate the percent cover for these different cover classes that the user has identified. So in this particular case, in this assessment, the tree canopy cover was 26.2% plus or minus 1.9% standard error. Now this is an important point to make here because with the image classification, it is a census. You know definitively, assuming that the image classification is accurate, and there are methods that we won't go into, but that's done, you know definitively what the percent land cover is. In contrast with this photo interpretation, because it is based on a statistical sampling, there's going to be a margin of error or uncertainty. And then the other thing to point out here is, of course, that you don't know where this canopy cover is. Now what you can do is you could set up an assessment where you ahead of time define neighborhood A versus neighborhood B versus neighborhood C and do 3 of these iTree Canopy assessments concurrently, and then you could compare and contrast them that way. But you really have no way of doing that straight out of the box and knowing again where that canopy is. So for that reason, this is really a high-level tool. This is just for getting a general understanding for very high-level strategic planning and really just getting a sense of the lay of the land. The really cool thing that I'll finally point out here about iTree Canopy is they use their iTree models to then associate that canopy cover with ecosystem services. So down here in this bottom portion of the chart, you can see an excerpt of the various air pollutants that this particular tree canopy assessment was associated with, and we can't see it because it's drowned out here by this text in the front. But what you would see there is the monetary value and the amount of those various pollutants that tree canopy is mitigating based on how much canopy is there and where that urban forest is located in the United States. I'm going to skip through this because I want to move on, but this is just showing our urban tree canopy analysis program at Virginia Tech. We actually created an urban tree canopy mapper that's available online that anyone can go and look at and query the urban tree canopy data for our 20-some localities in the state. If you're interested in finding out about this website and using it, just simply Google Virginia Urban Tree Canopy Mapper and you'll find it quite readily. And there are some instructional videos on how to use it. This is an example of Virginia Beach here, which is one of the localities that an image classification, again a census-based assessment, was done of tree canopy in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And then I mentioned Planet Geo a little while ago when we were talking about tree plotter light, but this is a product that we took the Canopy Mapper a step further when we were doing some technical assistance last summer, and we put together this WebGIS, we being Planet Geo, for a number of localities, in this particular case Virginia Beach, But this has, in a web-based platform, some fairly sophisticated GIS capabilities. That is that we can ask some high-level questions about the tree canopy that's there as it relates to land use, land cover, ownership, and so forth, in order to make some decisions about tree planting and tree protection prioritization. So just in this example here, I did a query. What I did was I asked the WebGIS, show me the parcels where tree canopy, existing canopy, is less than 20%, but the available planting area, that is non-tree vegetation, is greater than 20%, and the parcels are less than 3 acres. And the GIS answered this question for me. It said that there are about 1,800 out of about 12,000 parcels where these conditions apply. So the application would be that an urban forester could tailor some outreach or possibly some policy to those particular parcels where there's a high capacity for more canopy, yet low canopy, in order to increase canopy cover and overall raise the canopy coverage in the locality. And quite interestingly, following up on this example from Virginia Beach, they were one of our technical assistance partners, and in the last year they have put together their urban forest management plan, and it was heavily based upon this UTC analysis that they used to inform the development of this plan. So this is just a good concrete example of how an urban forest assessment can be used to inform the development of a management plan. Okay, so we have 2 more pop quiz questions here. First question here is, an urban tree canopy analysis can be used for what? If you're interested in responding, take a moment to do that. Okay, good. So you guys kind of picked up on the trend here. I like to use my questions to reaffirm learning. So in this particular case, the correct answer was D, all of the above. We can use a UTC analysis to quantify tree canopy, to prioritize tree planting and protection, and to educate the public and decision makers. And our last question of the day. iTree canopy is an example of an application used to do what? Okay, looking good. This might be a little bit of a, I wouldn't say a trick question, but it would certainly be one that might be easily misunderstood. The correct answer would be photo interpretation. Okay, the reason that it's not all of the above is because, well, a sample tree inventory is a ground-based bottom-up approach, whereas iTree canopy is a top-down approach or remote sensing technique. And remember that the image classification, those are typically custom assessments that are based on a pixel census. That is, every pixel in an image is classified into a land cover type from wall to wall. It's called wall-to-wall classification. Whereas with iTree canopy, there is an individual as opposed to the computer that is looking at a subset of those pixels and making an interpretation of what that land cover is. Okay, good. I've extended us over here a good bit, but I just want to wrap up by saying, and you'll be able to see this in both the PDF and the webinar, some of the good resources that are out there. First of all, with tree inventory, the International Society of Arboriculture published a best management practice on tree inventories, and the 2nd edition was published last year. American Forests has a really good resource guide online about urban forest assessment. I would encourage you to take a look at that. That goes into some details that we haven't been able to address here today. I mentioned earlier this guide to assessing urban forests. This is a publication from the Northern Research Station, and this is readily available in PDF format online. You can find it really easily by just Googling the title there. And here's where you'll find the iTree tools. Right now, the current version is 6.0.5. It was just updated in the last few weeks. There you'll find iTree Streets, iTree Eco, and iTree Canopy. Those are the 3 that we talked about today, as well as iTree View, as well as an assortment of other tools, as well as some guidance on urban tree canopy assessment. And then finally, Northern Research Station Interestingly enough, they actually have some existing urban forest data, so you can go there and you can download various types of both bottom-up as well as top-down data for various states and localities around the country. And they even have some specific information and guidance about urban tree canopy assessments there. Particularly, I want to point out Morgan Grove, he works in the Northern Research Station, has done a lot of scholarly work and technical work on urban tree canopy assessment, and has made some contributions to this website here. So here's what we learned today. We learned that urban forest assessment involves observation and evaluation of urban forest resources, and it has a lot of different potential applications. They're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes an assessment might be used for one or more of these things. We learned that urban forest assessment includes both bottom-up and top-down approaches, and they have different capabilities and limitations. We defined what a tree inventory is and how it's particularly powerful for understanding things about individual trees. So things such as the composition, the maintenance needs, and the ecosystem services of trees. And we looked at UTC analysis as an example of a top-down approach, particularly powerful for understanding the amount, distribution, and spatial relationships of tree canopy with the human environment. And we concluded today by looking at several different resources that are available both in the public and private sector that you might find helpful if you're thinking about conducting an urban forest assessment. So I got a little long-winded. I apologize for that, but I do want to open the floor now for any questions that you might have. I'll remind you that if you do need to run off quickly, but if you have some questions or follow-up comments for me, please feel free to email me at arborist@vt.edu. And those of you who hung in there with me for the entire time, I appreciate your time and attention.
All right. Thank you, Eric. I'm going to go ahead and push out our webinar quiz, so bear with me for just one moment. All right, and that's been pushed out. It should open a separate browser window with that quiz if you signed up for CEUs.